She has been called the world's first femme fatale, the last Pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who brought mighty Rome to its knees. But what if almost everything you think you know about Cleopatra is a carefully engineered illusion, a cocktail of propaganda, gossip, and Hollywood fantasy poured into history's glass until the truth became nearly invisible? Cleopatra VII Philippa is one of the most famous figures in all of antiquity. But the question we have to ask is this: was she truly the seductive temptress draped in gold and jewels? Or was she something far more dangerous to her enemies? An intelligent ruler, a strategist, a woman who played the game of power with more cunning than most of the men who wrote her story. When we strip away the layers of legend, what emerges is not just a queen, but a political survivor who understood how image, culture, and alliances could be wielded as weapons. In this story, we will unravel the contradictions, challenge the myths, and see Cleopatra not through the eyes of Rome, which painted her as a villain, but through the lens of history and critical thought, revealing a leader who turned her heritage, her intellect, and her charisma into a legacy that outlasted empires. But let me warn you, once you start questioning the myths, you may never see Cleopatra the same way again. Cleopatra was born into a dynasty that was already an oddity in Egyptian history, the Ptolemies, descendants of Macedonian Greeks who had ruled Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great, were foreigners on Egyptian soil, more comfortable speaking Greek and dining in Hellenistic fashion than embracing the traditions of the Nile. And yet Cleopatra would stand apart from them in one critical way. She learned the Egyptian language, spoke it fluently and consciously, presented herself as a living embodiment of Isis, a goddess who symbolized fertility, protection, and royal power. By doing so, she achieved something few of her ancestors managed. She convinced the Egyptian people that she was not simply a foreigner in a borrowed throne, but their queen in truth. The irony here is that while Roman writers later described her as the quintessential Egyptian, her bloodline was not purely Egyptian at all. And this tension between perception and reality is central to her story. She understood that power was not only about armies or gold, but about legitimacy, about convincing both the governed and the rivals abroad that her rule was natural and inevitable. She was also remarkably well educated for her time, trained in philosophy, mathematics, literature, and even science. But more importantly, she had a gift for languages, reportedly speaking as many as 9, which meant she could negotiate charm and intimidate without interpreters, giving her a psychological edge that male rulers of her time often underestimated. What made Cleopatra extraordinary was not just her royal title, but her ability to weave her Greek heritage and Egyptian presentation into a hybrid identity that was politically unassailable. In a world divided by culture, she made herself the bridge. Cleopatra's rise was anything but smooth, because the Ptolemaic dynasty was notorious for turning family into enemies and siblings into rivals. And her own path to power followed this brutal pattern. When her father Ptolemy XII died, the throne passed jointly to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, in line with dynastic tradition that demanded sibling marriages and coral. But Cleopatra was not content to share authority as a figurehead. She wanted full control, and quickly. Tensions erupted between her and the advisors backing her brother. Within a few years she was driven into exile, stripped of her throne by a court faction that found her independence threatening. But exile was not the end for Cleopatra. It was training ground, and she would use it to sharpen her political instincts. She understood that to reclaim power she would need leverage, and that leverage came not from Egypt's fractured nobility but from Rome, whose influence reached into every corridor of the Mediterranean world. It's tempting to think of Cleopatra here as a victim of circumstance, a young queen cast aside by scheming men. But the reality is far more interesting. She used her setback to recalibrate, studying her opponents, biding her time, and preparing to return stronger. When opportunity came in the form of Julius Caesar's arrival in Alexandria during Rome's own civil war, Cleopatra made a daring move that history still remembers, the legendary tale of her being smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled inside a carpet. May or may not be literal, but it symbolizes her courage, theatricality, and her understanding that politics is performance as much as policy. In that single gamble, she transformed herself from an exiled queen into a contender, once more aligning with the most powerful man in Rome to secure her throne, but also to set herself on a course that would make her story echo for centuries. Cleopatra's partnership with Julius Caesar was not simply a scandalous romance, as Roman gossip later portrayed it, but a calculated alliance between two ambitious leaders who recognized in each other the means to stabilize their precarious positions. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth, its grain, and its symbolic prestige, while Cleopatra needed Rome's muscle to silence her rivals and re-establish herself as Egypt's undisputed ruler. And together they forged an arrangement that was as strategic as it was personal. Yet Roman writers, eager to tarnish Caesar, emphasized the affair's sensuality, portraying Cleopatra as a seductress who ensnared the great general, when in truth she was leveraging diplomacy, charisma, and spectacle as tools of statecraft. When Caesar restored her to the throne, sharing nominal power with her younger brother, but ensuring she was the true authority, Cleopatra emerged not as a dependent mistress, but as a queen who had bent Rome's civil war to her advantage. The birth of their son Caesarion further solidified her claim for Egyptians. He was the living Horus, child of Isis and Pharaoh, a divine legitimization that wove Egyptian tradition and Roman connection into one potent symbol. Cleopatra's journey with Caesar extended beyond politics. However, she famously visited Rome, where her presence unsettled the Senate, for here was a foreign monarch treated as nearly equal to their dictator, an affront to the Roman Republic's ideals. And yet Cleopatra walked the city with regal confidence, her very existence a reminder that she was no provincial ruler but the queen of a civilization that had once rivaled Rome itself. What we see here is not simply a romance, but the fusion of ambition, politics, and image-making, with Cleopatra proving that survival in a brutal world required the boldness to gamble everything on both timing and presentation. The murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean, and for Cleopatra it was not just the death of a powerful ally, but a crisis that threatened to erase everything she had fought to rebuild. For in one stroke her protector was gone, and her enemies in Rome were eager to frame her as part of the problem, a foreign queen whose influence had corrupted the dictator. In the frantic days that followed, Cleopatra did not linger in Rome to plead her case. She returned swiftly to Egypt, bringing Caesarion with her, and this decision reveals her political instinct. She knew Rome's next chapter would be written in blood, and Egypt's survival depended on keeping her distance while preparing for the storm. Back in Alexandria, she faced the daunting task of ruling without Caesar's shield. But she leaned into the image she had carefully cultivated, the divine queen, Isis incarnate, sovereign of Egypt in her own right, and mother of a child who embodied both Egyptian legitimacy and Roman connection. Her throne was secure in name, but in practice she was surrounded by threats. her younger siblings still posed risks. Rival factions watched for weakness, and across the sea, Rome fractured into new factions led by men hungry for power. What we often overlook is how precarious Cleopatra's position really was. For Egypt had wealth, but lacked the military might to resist Rome outright, which meant she had to play her cards carefully, aligning with whichever Roman faction seemed most likely to dominate without letting Egypt become a mere pawn. It was in this turbulent atmosphere that she would encounter Mark Antony, one of Caesar's loyal generals. And through him, Cleopatra would once again reshape her destiny, not as a passive widow of Rome's fallen dictator, but as a queen who would dare to claim partnership with another rising star of Rome. When Cleopatra met Mark Antony, the encounter was destined to become legend, not because it was a simple romance, but because it fused two colossal ambitions in a world already fractured by civil war. Antony, one of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants, now stood as part of the triumvirate ruling Rome, and he needed both resources and legitimacy to sustain his campaigns. While Cleopatra sought a Roman protector who could safeguard Egypt's sovereignty without reducing her to a client queen, their meeting in Tarsus became one of history's most theatrical moments. For Cleopatra understood that presentation was power, and she sailed to him not as a supplicant, but as a goddess, her barge draped in purple sails, oars of silver cutting. Through the river, servants dressed as nymphs and cupids, while she herself reclined as Venus, queen and deity in one. Antony, whose reputation thrived on displays of excess and martial grandeur, was captivated not just by her presence but by the message. This was no mere monarch begging for Rome's favor. This was a ruler who demanded to be treated as his equal, in spectacle and in strength. Their partnership grew quickly, cemented by nights of revelry, hunting, feasting, and political maneuvering. But beneath the laughter lay cold calculation. Cleopatra secured Antony's protection and the promise of military aid against her rivals, while Antony gained access to Egypt's legendary wealth, its grain, and its aura of divine kingship. Together, they styled themselves as rulers not just of nations, but of myth itself, echoing the gods Dionysus and Isis, casting their union as something more cosmic than political. Roman propaganda would later twist this image into decadence and corruption, mocking Antony as a man enslaved by an exotic temptress. But in truth, Cleopatra was again writing her own script, ensuring that Egypt was not swallowed by Rome, but stood as a partner in shaping the future of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra and Mark Antony's relationship quickly evolved beyond its theatrical beginnings, becoming a partnership that blended personal intimacy with political calculation. For together, they were not merely lovers, but architects of an alternative vision of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children: Alexander, Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, and Ptolemy, Philadelphus, and in naming them, she made a statement of cosmic ambition, with Helios symbolizing the sun, Selene, the moon, and Philadelphus, the bond of family, casting their dynasty as one divinely ordained to rule heaven and earth. Antony, intoxicated by Cleopatra's wealth and charisma, but also shrewdly aware of the legitimacy she offered, began to base much of his political identity on their union, going so far as to stage elaborate ceremonies in Alexandria that proclaimed him as a new Dionysus and Cleopatra as the incarnation of Isis, presenting their children as rulers in waiting over vast stretches of land that Antony donated to them from Rome's conquered territories. These donations of Alexandria shocked and enraged Octavian back in Rome, for they suggested that Antony was building a parallel empire, one rooted not in the Senate's approval but in a hybrid Greco-Egyptian monarchy where Cleopatra's bloodline stood at the center. For Cleopatra, this was a masterstroke. She had not only secured Antony's loyalty but had woven her dynasty into the broader narrative of divine destiny, ensuring her children could claim power not just in Egypt, but across the Mediterranean. Yet beneath the splendor of parades and proclamations, their position was fragile because Octavian controlled Rome's narrative, portraying Cleopatra as the foreign witch who had bewitched Antony, and Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Roman virtue for Oriental decadence. Here is where we see Cleopatra's greatest strength and greatest vulnerability. She could shape image within her sphere, but once her enemies controlled the wider story, her carefully crafted persona became the weapon used against her. Long before swords clashed or ships rammed at sea, Cleopatra's greatest enemy became Octavian's mastery of propaganda, for he understood that in Rome perception often mattered more than reality, and he wove a narrative that transformed and Cleopatra into villains threatening the Republic's survival. In speeches and pamphlets he painted Cleopatra as an exotic enchantress who had ensnared Antony, making him a slave to her luxuries and corrupting him with foreign decadence, while Antony was cast as a Roman gone rogue, a traitor who had abandoned his wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for a queen who sought to replace Rome's Senate with her own dynasty. What is striking is how gender and xenophobia were weaponized together. Cleopatra was not attacked simply for her politics, but for being a woman who wielded authority, for being a foreigner who dared to dictate terms to Rome, and in this smear campaign we see the timeless strategy of discrediting powerful women by turning them into caricatures of seduction and manipulation. Octavian, in contrast, presented himself as the defender of traditional Roman values, the sober guardian of discipline and order, a man who would protect the Republic from the Eastern menace embodied by Cleopatra. The brilliance of his propaganda was that it framed the conflict not as a civil war between Roman generals, which it truly was, but as a righteous war of Rome against a foreign queen, thereby making any opposition to him appear unpatriotic. Cleopatra, for all her skill in shaping image at home, could not counter Rome's echo chamber, and Antony's reliance on her wealth and fleet only reinforced Octavian's claims. Thus, the stage was set for confrontation, not just of armies, but of two competing visions of legitimacy, one rooted in Rome's Senate and tradition, the other in divine kingship and dynastic ambition. By the time the rival camps converged in 31 BCE, the Mediterranean was holding its breath, for the conflict between Octavian and Antony with Cleopatra was no longer merely about political rivalries, but about whose vision of empire would dominate the known world. Antony and Cleopatra assembled their forces in Greece, amassing a fleet of more than 200 ships and tens of thousands of troops, while Octavian, under the tactical brilliance of his admiral Agrippa, moved swiftly to cut off their supply lines, isolating their army from food and reinforcements. Cleopatra's presence at Actium has long been debated by historians, with Roman writers ridiculing her as a distraction who weakened Antony's judgment. But when we look more carefully, it becomes clear that her fleet was critical to the war effort. She did not come as a passive consort, but as an equal partner contributing naval power, wealth, and strategy. Antony, for his part, was caught in a dilemma: to strike quickly with his larger ships and risk everything in a single gamble, or to retreat inland and wage a longer campaign where his land forces might prevail. Octavian's propaganda had already framed this as a war against Cleopatra rather than Antony, which meant that Antony's reliance on her fleet, though militarily sound, politically doomed him in the eyes of many Romans. The battle itself became a test not just of military strength, but of discipline and morale. And Octavian's forces had the advantage. His ships were lighter, more maneuverable, and his men better supplied, while Antony's massive queen lumbered heavily, suffocated by the blockade and weakened by hunger. Cleopatra, commanding her own squadron, was poised for either victory or desperate flight, depending on how the tide turned. And in that tension we can see how her fate, Antony's legacy, and Rome's future all hung by a thread on the waves of Actium. When the Battle of Actium erupted on September 2nd, 31 BCE, it was less a sudden explosion of chaos than a slow grind of attrition. With Antony's heavy ships locked against Octavian's agile squadrons in a stalemate of endurance and maneuver, Antony's forces tried to break through, his larger vessels relying on brute strength and towering decks crowded with archers and soldiers. But Octavian's Admiral Agrippa exploited the wind, keeping his ships mobile, darting in and out like wolves harrying a larger prey. And gradually exhaustion began to wear on Antony's men, who were already weakened by hunger and dwindling supplies. In the midst of this grinding deadlock, Cleopatra made her fateful move, her fleet breaking from formation and sailing southward, perhaps as a planned retreat, perhaps as part of an escape strategy that Antony intended to follow, but Roman propaganda would forever frame it as a cowardly flight. Antony, seeing her ships depart, abandoned the fight and followed, leaving much of his fleet to collapse in confusion. And from that moment, Octavian's victory was assured. His men seized the advantage, burning and capturing ships, while Antony and Cleopatra retreated with only a fraction of their power intact. Historians still debate whether Cleopatra's maneuver was betrayal, foresight, or desperation, but what matters is how Octavian weaponized the moment, declaring that Antony had thrown away Roman honor to chase a foreign queen, a narrative that cemented his moral victory as much as his military one. For Cleopatra, the battle was not just a defeat, but the unraveling of the image she had worked so hard to build, no longer Isis enthroned, but a queen on the run, her survival now dependent on what scraps of loyalty she and Antony could salvage as they fled back to Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra's return to Egypt after Actium was not a triumphant homecoming but a retreat under shadows. Their once mighty alliance stripped down to fragments, their soldiers demoralized, their fleets shattered, their allies drifting away like sand slipping through open hands. Alexandria, with its gleaming palaces and bustling harbors, had long been the jewel of Cleopatra's reign, but now it became a gilded cage where the queen and her Roman partner scrambled to project confidence while the world knew they were cornered. Antony's spirit, once larger than life, began to fracture under the weight of defeat, oscillating between bursts of bravado and moments of despair. And Cleopatra, ever the strategist, quietly began securing treasure, supplies, and potential escape routes, aware that Octavian's advance was relentless. Yet even in this desperate hour, Cleopatra did not surrender her gift for spectacle. She staged grand banquets and festivals, reminding her people of Egypt's wealth and divine favor, as if sheer performance might hold off the inevitable. And in this we see the duality of her genius and her tragedy. She believed in the power of image to shape reality, but reality now pressed harder than ever. Octavian, meanwhile, played his part masterfully, sending messages across the Mediterranean that framed his campaign as a liberation of Rome from Cleopatra's tyranny rather than a civil war against Antony. And each proclamation further isolated the embattled queen, Inside Alexandria's walls, whispers grew louder, courtiers hedged their bets, and Cleopatra herself began weighing the loyalty of every ally, wondering who would stand firm and who would betray her when Octavian's legions finally appeared on the horizon. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces closed in on Egypt, and the stage was set for the final act of Antony and Cleopatra's tragic saga. Antony, once a general feared across the Roman world, now commanded only a fraction of his former strength, his armies weary and his allies scattered. Yet he attempted to rally his men for one last defense of Alexandria, appealing not only to their loyalty but to their pride, that even in defeat, Rome's veterans would rather die fighting than surrender to Octavian's banner. Cleopatra, pragmatic as always, considered negotiation as her most powerful weapon, sending envoys to Octavian to explore terms that might spare her children and preserve Egypt's dignity. But Octavian's strategy was cold and methodical. He would accept no compromise that left her with power, for he wanted to parade her as a captive in his Roman triumph, a living symbol of his victory over the East. The tension between Antony's insistence on martial honor and Cleopatra's instinct for survival deepened the cracks between them, yet their fates were bound too tightly to separate. When Octavian's troops stormed the outskirts of Alexandria, Antony launched a desperate counterattack, more a gesture of defiance than a real chance at victory. And for a fleeting moment he tasted the fire of his old glory, pushing Octavian's men back before being overwhelmed. The end came swiftly thereafter, misled into believing Cleopatra was already dead. Antony turned his sword on himself, choosing to die by Roman steel rather than humiliation at the hands of his rival. But even this final act unfolded with bitter irony, for he did not die instantly and was instead carried, bleeding, to Cleopatra's hidden chamber, where he gasped his last breath in her arms, leaving the queen not only widowed but stripped of her final protector, her world collapsing, as Octavian's legions marched into her city. With Antony gone, Cleopatra found herself standing alone against the most formidable power in the ancient world. And now every decision she made carried the weight not only of her own survival but of her dynasty's future. Octavian entered Alexandria, cautiously but confidently, knowing the queen still commanded loyalty among her people. Yet his ambition was clear. He sought not partnership but spectacle, for he envisioned Cleopatra as the crowning trophy of his triumph, paraded in chains through Rome as living proof of his victory. Cleopatra, however, understood humiliation was worse than death, and she began her final campaign not on the battlefield, but in the subtle theater of diplomacy, charm, and psychological warfare. She received Octavian's envoys in dazzling displays of wealth, surrounding herself with gold, rare perfumes, and attendants dressed like deities, signaling that even in defeat she was still Isis, not a prisoner but a sovereign. Privately, she weighed whether to negotiate, flee, or embrace death on her own terms. And it is here that Cleopatra's story shifts from political drama to existential reckoning. She could no longer outmaneuver her enemies with alliances or fleets, but she could control the narrative of her own ending. She even considered passing power to her children, Caesarion most of all, but Octavian was ruthless and pragmatic, and though he promised mercy to her offspring, Cleopatra surely knew those words were masks hiding the cold logic of empire. Rome allowed no rivals, not even children. What strikes us most is that in her final days, Cleopatra did not shrink into despair, but maintained her defiance. negotiating from a position of dignity even as the walls closed in, crafting her legacy so that she would never be remembered as a prisoner dragged through foreign streets, but as a queen who chose her destiny when all other choices were stripped away. Cleopatra's final days were spent in a tension between theatre and inevitability, for she knew Octavian wanted her alive to march in his triumph, and that very desire gave her the weapon of refusal. She could deny him his greatest spectacle by ending her life on her own terms. Ancient sources tell conflicting tales. Some say she meticulously prepared her death in a hidden chamber filled with treasure and relics of her reign. Others suggest she tested poisons on prisoners to find one swift and painless enough for her final act, and the most enduring legend claims she smuggled in a venomous asp hidden in a basket of figs, letting the serpent deliver her into the afterlife as Isis returning to Osiris. Whether snake, dagger, or potion, what matters is not the method, but the message. Cleopatra refused to be paraded as Rome's captive, instead crafting her exit as an act of sovereignty, transforming defeat into a final gesture of control. Octavian, when he learned of her death, purportedly was both furious and awed. Robbed of his triumph, yet aware that Cleopatra had preserved her dignity in a way Rome could never erase. For her children, however, the outcome was crueler. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, was hunted down and executed, for Octavian would not allow any rival claimant to linger, while her younger children with Antony were taken to Rome, raised in Octavia's household, curiosities of empire rather than heirs of Egypt. Cleopatra's death, therefore, closed not just a reign but an entire dynasty, ending centuries of pharaohs and folding Egypt permanently into the Roman world. Yet her choice ensured that she remained not a captive footnote in Octavian's parade, but a sovereign remembered across millennia, her ending echoing with both tragedy and defiance. With Cleopatra gone, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, Rome's first emperor, wasted no time in rewriting her story, turning her from a queen who had fiercely defended her throne into a cautionary tale of foreign seduction and feminine danger. Roman poets and historians, funded and encouraged by the new regime, framed her not as a sovereign but as the temptress who ruined Antony, reducing their years of shared governance, strategy, and ambition to a single narrative of lust that led to civil war. This reframing was not accidental. It was political theatre meant to elevate Octavian as Rome's savior while stripping Cleopatra of her agency. For to admit she was a capable ruler would have been to admit that Rome's victory was not inevitable, and Augustus needed inevitability to legitimize his reign. Yet history is never as simple as propaganda, and across centuries Cleopatra's image would be reshaped again and again. Medieval chroniclers painted her as a femme fatale. Renaissance artists rendered her as a tragic heroine, enlightenment. Writers debated her intellect, and modern cinema turned her into a symbol of beauty and romance, each era projecting its own anxieties and fantasies onto her life. But beneath the myths, the real Cleopatra emerges as something more compelling than any caricature. She was a polyglot ruler, a strategist who navigated between empires, a mother who tried to secure her dynasty, and a woman who chose death rather than humiliation, and it is this complexity that makes her one of the most enduring figures of antiquity. Her story reminds us that history is often written by those who conquer, but legends endure because they carry truths too powerful to erase, and Cleopatra's truth is that she refused to be reduced. She refused to be broken, and she left the world not as a prisoner but as a queen. Cleopatra's life did not end with her death because her image has outlived empires. adapted into countless forms by cultures searching for meaning in her story. And this is why she remains one of the most recognizable figures of the ancient world. For feminists, she has often been reclaimed as a symbol of female agency in a world designed to silence women. Proof that even within patriarchal empires, a woman could command armies, shape alliances, and define her destiny. For others, she has been cast as a warning about ambition, a figure used to argue that passion and politics should never mix. Though such interpretations reveal more about those who retell her story than about Cleopatra herself. Scholars remind us that she was not merely a seductress nor only a tragic heroine, but a ruler whose reign stabilized Egypt's economy, expanded trade networks, and positioned Alexandria as one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world. The fact that she could speak so many languages is itself symbolic. She was a bridge between cultures, navigating Greek heritage, Egyptian tradition, and Roman realpolitik with remarkable dexterity. In literature and art, her afterlife is equally rich. From Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, which immortalized her as both passionate and cunning, to modern novels and films that transform her into everything from political strategist to romantic icons. What binds all these versions is a fascination with her refusal to fit into a single box. For Cleopatra resists simplification. She was a mother and a monarch, a diplomat and a performer, a survivor and finally a defiant, martyr to her own dignity. In remembering her, we are also forced to confront how history itself works, how stories are shaped by victors and reshaped by those who come after, and how truth is often braided with myth until the two are impossible to fully separate, leaving us with a figure who is at once historical and eternal. As we close the story of Cleopatra, it becomes clear that her importance lies not only in what she did, but in what her life continues to represent. For she reminds us that power is never simply about armies and treaties, but about perception, narrative, and the courage to assert oneself against impossible odds. In her, we see a ruler who understood the theater of politics better than many modern leaders. A woman who used image, language, and symbolism as weapons as sharp as any sword. And in this sense, she was centuries ahead of her time. Her downfall was not simply the result of personal flaws or reckless romance, as Roman propagandists claimed, but of a collision between two worlds, a fading Hellenistic kingdom and a rising Roman Empire, whose machine of conquest spared no rival. Yet Cleopatra's choice at the end to deny Octavian the satisfaction of her humiliation turned defeat into a final act of agency, ensuring that her story would never be one of simple conquest, but of defiance. Today, in an era where narratives still shape politics and perception still determines power, Cleopatra's life feels strikingly relevant. She shows us how identity can be both a strength and a weapon used against us, how leadership requires not just strategy but performance, and how even in loss there can be dignity if one refuses to surrender control of one's story. This is why Cleopatra has endured when so many others have faded, because she teaches us that legacies are not written only by victors, but also by those who refuse to be erased. In the end, Cleopatra was not merely the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was a queen who fought to the very edge of possibility, a strategist who used brilliance in a world stacked against her, and a woman who ensured that history would never forget her name. Cleopatra's life is more than a chronicle of alliances and battles. It is a mirror held up to power itself, showing us how fragile it can be when built on perception, how dangerous it becomes when twisted by propaganda, and how enduring it is when anchored in defiance. She was vilified by Rome, romanticized by poets, idolized by artists, and reclaimed by modern voices. Yet beneath every retelling remains the same truth. She was a leader who refused to be silenced, who fought with intelligence and daring, even when the odds were stacked against her, and who, in the final moment, chose sovereignty over humiliation. Her story reminds us to question the narratives handed down by victors, to see how gender, race, and politics shape the way figures are remembered, and to recognize that true power is not only in conquest, but in the ability to define your own ending. Whether we admire her as a strategist, a symbol of resilience, or a tragic heroine, Cleopatra endures because she embodies the universal struggle between ambition and survival, dignity and defeat, myth and reality. And so the lesson is this: history may not always be kind, but if you can seize the pen, even at the last breath, you can shape the way you are remembered forever.